February 18th, 1945, Camp Livingston, Louisiana. A young woman stands frozen beneath a showerhead, her hands trembling around a bar of soap. Not ash, not sand, not rationed paste. Real fragrant soap. She had been told Americans were monsters. But in that moment, as hot water poured endlessly and lather slipped through her fingers, everything she had been taught began to dissolve. Her name was Reiko Tanaka, 26 years old, administrative clerk in the Imperial Japanese Navy. And that bar of soap weighing just 4 ounces was about to change not only her life, but the future of an entire nation. This is the untold story of 73 Japanese women who were captured as enemies, treated as students, and returned home to rebuild a country from ashes. It begins with a bar of soap. It ends with an economic miracle. And what happens in between will challenge everything you thought you knew about winning hearts and minds. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button. Because the journey ahead reveals how American abundance, not cruelty, defeated Japanese propaganda more thoroughly than any bomb. How soap, bacon, breakfast, and ice cream on Fridays transformed enemies into teachers, and how these women, once prisoners, became the quiet architects of modern Japan. But to understand the earthquake, we must first understand the ground that is about to crack. Reiko Tanaka was born in 1919 in Yokohama, a port city that hummed with industry and aspiration. Her father, Hiroshi Tanaka, was a naval engineer who supervised construction at the Imperial Navy shipyards, a man of rigid discipline and unwavering faith in the divine emperor, a man who believed every word the government told him about Japan's destiny to rule Asia. Her mother, Ayame, was different, quieter, more observant. While Hiroshi lectured at dinner tables about Japanese superiority, Ayame would slip away to the kitchen, where she kept a small tin box hidden behind the rice sacks. Inside that box, she hoarded soap slivers, tiny fragments saved from bars that had vanished from civilian shelves years before. When young Reiko discovered the box at age 12, her mother pressed a finger to her lips and whispered 6 words that would haunt the girl for years. Because scarcity is not virtue, daughter. Then Ayame burned 2 of the soap slivers in the stove, destroying the evidence, and told Reiko to forget what she had seen. But Reiko never forgot. She learned instead to live between 2 truths. The official truth, spoken loudly in classrooms and on radio broadcasts, demanded complete belief. Americans were lazy, racially impure. Their wealth was decadence, not strength. Japan's endurance and sacrifice would always prevail. Teachers drilled these lessons with the same repetition used for multiplication tables. Magazines celebrated housewives who cleaned with ash and rice bran, praising their resourcefulness as moral superiority. Radio announcers proclaimed that American soldiers collapsed without comforts, while Japanese warriors fought on empty stomachs, their spirits unbreakable. The secret truth lived in whispers and hidden tin boxes. It lived in the poetry books Reiko smuggled into her bedroom. English poets Keats and Whitman, writers who celebrated abundance of language, of emotion, of life itself. She would read by candlelight and then burn the pages one by one, watching words about beauty and plenty turn to ash, just like her country was turning beauty and plenty into something to be ashamed of. Reiko had dreamed of becoming a literature teacher, of spending her days with books and young minds, exploring the kind of abundance her mother's soapbox hinted at. But in 1937, when she turned 18, the government had other plans. All educated young women were required to serve. The choice was factory work or military administration. Reiko chose the latter, hoping for something closer to her dreams. She was assigned to the Imperial Japanese Navy Women's Administrative Corps. By 1940, she was a clerk aboard the hospital ship Asahi Maru, processing medical records and supply requisitions. The work was tedious, but it kept her away from the increasingly militant atmosphere of the home islands. And she was not alone. Lieutenant Michiko Hayashi commanded the ship's medical administrative section. 34 years old, a trained doctor who had been diverted into paperwork when the military decided women physicians were inappropriate for combat zones. Michiko was pragmatic, sharp-eyed, and possessed a dangerous quality in wartime Japan. She asked questions. Why, she would murmur while reviewing supply manifests, does our entire medical corps receive less gauze in a month than one American field hospital uses in a week? How she would wonder aloud when electricity failed for the 3rd time in an evening. Can we claim industrial superiority when we cannot keep lights burning on a hospital ship? Then there was Tomiko Sato, 23, a file clerk from Osaka, who believed every word of the propaganda with the fervor of youth. She reported suspicious conversations to the ship's security officer. She refused to question anything. To Tomiko, doubt was betrayal, and betrayal deserved punishment. And Yuriko Kimura, the youngest at 19, a nurse's aide from Nagasaki, sheltered, naive, still young enough to believe that the adults in charge must know what they were doing. She had a younger brother, Kenji, 17, training with a rifle he could barely lift, preparing to die for an empire that could not feed him. These women and 69 others served aboard the Asahi Maru as it moved through Pacific waters in early 1945. By then, the war was clearly lost to anyone willing to see. American submarines controlled the seas. Supply lines were severed. The hospital ship carried wounded soldiers who whispered when the officers were not listening that they had not eaten meat in 6 months, that their boots had fallen apart, that they were being sent to die with empty rifles in emptier stomachs. But the official truth remained unchanged. Japan would prevail. Spirit would overcome material weakness. The Americans were soft, corrupted by luxury, certain to collapse when faced with true warriors. Reiko had stopped believing the official truth somewhere in the autumn of 1944. The moment arrived during a routine supply audit when she discovered that the entire ship's medical staff was allocated 12 bars of soap per month, 12 bars for 200 people. She did the math in her journal that night, working by candlelight because the generators were down again. 0.06 bars per person per month. She thought about her mother's hidden tin box, about the soap slivers hoarded like jewels, about a nation that had convinced itself that going without was somehow noble. That night, Reiko wrote a poem, the first in 2 years. She wrote about hands that forgot what clean felt like, about a country that praised dirt as discipline. And then, as she had always done, she burned it, watching the words curl and blacken, watching truth turn to ash because truth had become too dangerous to keep. She did not know that in 3 months, truth would find her anyway. Not in words she burned, but in a bar of soap she could not put down. January 12, 1945, 200 miles west of the Philippines. The Asahi Maru was traveling under Red Cross markings, protected theoretically by the Geneva Convention. Hospital ships were not supposed to be targets. But in the chaos of the Pacific War, protections meant little. American destroyers appeared on the horizon at dawn. The Asahi Maru's captain immediately signaled surrender. There would be no fight, no heroic last stand, just a hospital ship full of wounded soldiers and 73 women who suddenly faced the monsters they had been taught to fear. Reiko stood on deck as American sailors were boarded. She expected execution. Japanese propaganda had been clear. Americans murdered prisoners routinely, tortured women, violated every rule of warfare. She braced herself for violence. What she got instead was a young sailor, maybe 20 years old, who looked at the women gathered on deck and said in halting textbook Japanese, "You are now prisoners of the United States Navy. You will not be harmed. Please follow the officers." Tomiko Sato spat at his feet. "We die with honor," she hissed in Japanese. "We do not surrender to animals." The sailor did not understand the words, but he understood the gesture. He stepped back, hand moving toward his sidearm, then stopping. An older officer appeared, placed a hand on the young sailor's shoulder, and said something Reiko could not hear. The officer then turned to the women and spoke in perfect Japanese. "You are protected under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. We are not your enemy anymore. We are your custodians until this war ends. Please cooperate, and no harm will come to you." Lieutenant Michiko Hayashi stepped forward. As the senior officer among the women, she understood that what happened in the next few seconds would set the tone for everything that followed. She bowed slightly formally and said, "We will cooperate, but we ask that our wounded soldiers receive medical care." The American officer nodded. "They will. Our doctors are already below deck. You have my word." Michiko turned to the women behind her. Her voice was quiet but carried complete authority. "Tomiko, stand down. All of you listen to me. We are alive. In war, that is victory enough. Stay alive. Observe everything. If we survive, Japan will need what we learn." Later, Reiko would remember those words as the moment everything changed, not because they were inspiring, but because they were permission. Permission to survive instead of dying for honor. Permission to watch and learn instead of resisting and being destroyed. Permission to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was something to learn from the enemy. The women were transported to Pearl Harbor for processing. It took 6 days by ship, 6 days of waiting for the cruelty that never came. They were kept in a secure section of the vessel, given 3 meals a day of rice, fish, and vegetables. Simple food, but more than they had eaten regularly in months. Yuriko vomited twice because her stomach, accustomed to scarcity, could not handle sudden abundance. At Pearl Harbor, the processing began. 73 women stripped, deloused, medically examined. It was humiliating but professional. Female U.S. Navy nurses conducted the examinations, explaining each procedure in slow, careful English that a translator rendered into Japanese. When one nurse noticed Reiko shivering, not from cold but from fear, the woman brought a blanket without being asked, wrapped it around Reiko's shoulders, smiled and said, "You are safe here." Reiko clutched the blanket and tried to reconcile the gesture with everything she had been taught. Monsters did not bring blankets. Animals did not smile reassuringly. But these were Americans, and Americans were supposed to be monsters. The dissonance created a crack in Reiko's understanding of the world. A small crack, but enough. What widened the crack into a fissure was what happened during her medical exam. The nurse used fresh gauze to clean a small cut on Reiko's arm. Used it once, then threw the entire roll into a waste bin. Just threw it away. In Japan, gauze was washed and reused 10 times, 15 times until it fell apart. Here, an American nurse discarded a full roll because it had touched one tiny wound. Reiko stared at the waste bin long after the nurse had moved on. She tried to calculate how much gauze her entire ship received in a month versus how much this single medical station threw away in a day. The numbers did not make sense, could not make sense, unless everything she had been told about American weakness was backwards. The translator, a Japanese-American woman from California, noticed Reiko's fixation. She spoke quietly. "It is difficult to see at first how much there is, how little it means to them, because there is always more. You will get used to it." Reiko looked up. "Does it ever stop being shocking?" The translator smiled sadly. "I grew up here. It was normal for me. But when I visited Japan in 1938, I could not believe how little you had, how much you convinced yourselves that having nothing was somehow noble. That shocked me more than abundance shocks you." That conversation stayed with Reiko through the next week as the women were transferred to a military transport bound for the continental United States. Destination Camp Livingston, Louisiana, a former Women's Army Corps training facility that had been repurposed to hold female prisoners of war. During the 6-day journey, they were fed 3 meals daily, meat, bread, fruit, milk, every single day. By the 3rd day, even Tomiko Sato was eating without complaint, though she refused to acknowledge that the food was good. Yuriko gained 4 pounds and cried about it, convinced she was becoming fat, while her brother trained somewhere in the Pacific with an empty stomach. Michiko organized the women during the voyage, created a quiet hierarchy that would help them survive whatever came next. She divided them into groups based on skills and temperament. Nurses in one group, clerks in another, the most resistant personalities separated so they would not reinforce each other's defiance. And she gave them all the same instruction. Watch everything. Remember everything. This war will end. Japan will need rebuilding. And we, whether we like it or not, are the ones who will have seen both sides. That makes us valuable if we are smart and dangerous if we are stupid. So be smart. Watch, learn, survive. The transport arrived in New Orleans on February 14, 1945. From there, a train took them north to Camp Livingston. Reiko had never been on a train before. The speed, the smoothness, the casual way the American soldiers moved through the cars, as if this miracle of transportation was utterly ordinary. She watched Louisiana pass outside the windows, farmland, forests, small towns, electric lights in every building. Cars on roads, people going about their lives as if there was no war at all. When they arrived at Camp Livingston, it was late afternoon. The camp sat among pine forests, a collection of wooden barracks arranged in neat rows. A fence surrounded the complex, but it was not the imposing barrier Reiko had expected. Just chain link, almost casual in its construction. Guard towers stood at intervals, but the guards looked bored rather than menacing. The women were led to Barracks C. Inside, they found rows of bunk beds, footlockers, windows, that actually had glass, and at the far end a door marked showers and latrines. The barracks were heated in February in Louisiana, where it was not even particularly cold. But the Americans heated their prisoner barracks anyway because they could. Reiko was assigned Bunk 14 with Tomiko Sato and Yuriko Kimura as her immediate neighbors. Lieutenant Machiko had a bunk near the door where she could monitor the comings and goings. The women unpacked the few possessions they had been allowed to bring. Then they waited, unsure what would happen next. What happened next was dinner. At 1800 hours, they were marched to the mess hall, a large wooden building with long tables and a serving line that smelled like food Reiko had only read about in English novels. The women filed through, each given an aluminum tray, a metal cup, metal utensils. In Japan, metal had been confiscated for weapons manufacturing since 1942. Civilians ate from wooden bowls with wooden chopsticks. But here prisoners ate from metal as if it fell from the sky in unlimited supply. The servers piled food onto each tray, pork chops thick and real, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, green beans, bread with butter, actual butter, not the margarine substitute that had vanished from Japan years ago, an apple whole and fresh, milk cold and white and impossible. 73 women sat at tables and stared at their trays in silence. No one ate. They waited for the illusion to collapse, for the guards to laugh and take it away, for the propaganda film cameras to stop rolling. But no one laughed. No cameras appeared. The American soldiers at nearby tables ate identical meals, talking and joking, as if this abundance was the most ordinary thing in the world. Machiko picked up her fork. She cut a piece of pork chop, chewed it slowly, swallowed, looked up with an expression Reiko had never seen on the lieutenant's face. Wonder mixed with something like terror. "Eat," Michiko said quietly. "You will need strength regardless." So they ate. Some cried while they did. Some ate mechanically, refusing to acknowledge taste or pleasure. Tomiko ate in angry silence, each bite an admission she refused to voice. Yuriko ate and then ran to the latrine to vomit her body, unable to process richness it had never known. Reiko ate slowly, trying to memorize every sensation. The salt, the fat, the tenderness of meat that had been cooked with care. This single meal contained more calories, more nutrition, more care than 3 days of rations in Tokyo. And it was served to prisoners, to enemies. On a Tuesday evening in February, as if Tuesday evenings always looked like this. After dinner, they returned to Barracks C. It was 2015 hours. In Tokyo, electricity would have been cut off for 15 minutes already. The 2-hour ration from 1800 to 2000 was sacred, never extended, always enforced. Reiko had spent her entire adult life planning around that schedule. Reading by daylight, finishing tasks before darkness, learning to navigate her world in 2-hour increments of power. She entered the barracks and saw the light switches on the walls. Simple toggle switches, the kind she had seen in books but never used. In Japan, switches were locked or removed entirely to prevent wasting electricity. Here they were just mounted on walls, available to anyone. Reiko approached the nearest switch. It was 2047 hours. 47 minutes passed when lights should have failed. Her hands shook as she reached for the toggle. She flipped it down. The lights in her section went out. She flipped it up. The lights came back on. No alarm sounded. No guard rushed in to scold her. The electricity simply obeyed, instant and available. She flipped the switch again. Off, on, started counting in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each time the lights responded immediately. No delay, no rationing, no punishment for use. Yuriko appeared at her shoulder, whispering urgently, "Stop, it is a trap. They want us to waste it so they can punish us." But Reiko could not stop. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The lights kept responding, kept proving that electricity here was not precious, not rationed, not something to be hoarded and controlled. It was just available, always, without limit. By the 17th toggle, she was crying. Quiet tears that she did not bother to wipe away. Because if Americans could provide unlimited electricity to enemy prisoners in a random barracks in Louisiana, what did that say about Japan's chances of victory? What did that say about every lecture her father had given about American weakness? What did that say about sacrifice as strength when the enemy did not even understand the concept of going without? Machiko approached and gently pulled Reiko's hand away from the switch. I know, the lieutenant said quietly. Now come. We need to talk about what we are seeing. That night, 18 women gathered in a quiet corner of Barrack C. Michiko led the discussion in whispers, though there was no rule against talking. We are noticing things, she began, things that do not match what we were told. I want each of you to describe one thing that surprised you today. Just one. We will see if patterns emerge. They went around the circle. A nurse named Akiko Watanabe spoke of the dental clinic she had glimpsed during processing. Americans provided dental care to guards and prisoners alike. In Tokyo, her father had waited 8 months for a tooth extraction with no anesthetic. Here, people got cavities filled on request. Fumiko Oshiro, an engineering student, before conscription, talked about the electrical system. She had counted at least 40 separate lights in their single barracks. One building, she said, has more electric fixtures than my entire neighborhood in Osaka. Yuriko, still shaken from vomiting, whispered about the food. My brother gets 600 calories a day as a soldier. We were served over 2,000 calories at dinner. They feed prisoners better than we feed warriors. When it came to Reiko's turn, she held up her hand, still trembling slightly. The light switch. I tested it 17 times. It never failed, never delayed, never required permission. They give prisoners unlimited electricity because it is too abundant to bother rationing. Tomiko Sato sat at the edge of the circle, arms crossed, face hard. She did not speak, but she was listening. And that Michiko noted quietly was a start. The meeting dispersed near midnight. The lights were still on. The heat still ran. No one had told them to sleep, but exhaustion pulled most of the women to their bunks. Reiko lay in bunk 14, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of electricity that never stopped. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Americans are soft. Their abundance makes them weak. Japan's endurance will prevail. But lying in a heated barracks with lights that never failed and a full stomach for the first time in years, Reiko understood with devastating clarity that her father was wrong. Abundance did not make Americans weak. Abundance made them so strong they could afford to be generous, could afford to feed enemies, could afford to light prisoner barracks all night long because the cost was negligible. And Japan, with all its talk of spirit and sacrifice, was losing to a country that considered heated floors for prisoners too basic to even mention. She did not sleep that night, just lay awake, feeling the warmth, hearing the electric hum, and understanding that the earthquake had already begun. The soap shower that would complete the shattering would come tomorrow. But the crack in her worldview had already spread too wide to repair. Morning came to Camp Livingston with a clarity that felt almost violent. February 16, 1945. The sun rose over Louisiana pine forests while 73 Japanese women woke to their first full day as prisoners of abundance. Most had barely slept. Reiko Tanaka, dressed in silence, pulling on the plain cotton shirt and trousers the Americans had provided. The fabric was new, not repaired, not patched, not handed down. New. She tried not to think about what that meant. At 0700 hours, a guard appeared at the barracks door. Corporal Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, farm girl from Iowa, with blonde hair pinned back and a smile that seemed permanently fixed to her face. She spoke in slow, careful English that the translator rendered into Japanese. Good morning, ladies. Breakfast is at 0730, but first, showers. Group of 10, please follow me. The word showers sent a ripple of tension through the room. In Japan, bathing was communal but private, a ritual of cleaning that happened in careful increments with rationed water. Here they were being ordered to shower in an enemy facility with no idea what to expect. Tomiko Sato muttered something about humiliation tactics. Yuriko Kimura clutched her towel like a shield. Michiko Hayashi simply nodded and selected 9 other women to go first. Reiko was among them. They followed Corporal Mitchell down a path to a concrete building marked hygiene facility. Inside, the air was warm and humid. Tile covered the floors and walls, clean white tile that gleamed under electric lights. 10 shower heads protruded from one wall, each with its own knob. A wooden bench held stacks of towels, and on a metal shelf sat rows of small white bars. Soap, Corporal Mitchell gestured to the shelf. 1 bar per person. Take your time. Hot water lasts long as you need. She demonstrated turning the shower knob, and water immediately gushed out, steaming in the cool morning air. Then she left, closing the door behind her to give them privacy. The 10 women stood in silence, staring at the soap bars like they were unexploded ordnance. Michiko moved first. She picked up a bar, held it to her nose, inhaled. Ivory, she read from the label in halting English. 99 and 44 100% pure. She looked at the other women. It is real. This is not a test. Take one, use it. Reiko approached the shelf with the same caution she might approach a shrine. Her fingers closed around a bar. It was cool and smooth and heavier than she expected. 4 ounces, maybe. The scent hit her immediately. Not the harsh lye smell of homemade soap, not the faint chemical trace of the paste substitutes that had replaced real soap in Japan. This was fragrant, clean. It smelled like something that existed only in poems about spring mornings and fresh laundry. She carried it to a shower head, as if carrying something sacred. Turned the knob the way Corporal Mitchell had demonstrated. Water exploded from the shower, hot and forceful. She gasped at the temperature, adjusted the knob, found a warmth that felt like luxury incarnate. Then she wet the soap and brought it to her hands. It lathered, thick, rich, impossible lather that covered her palms and slid between her fingers. She had not seen lather like this since childhood, before the war, before scarcity became virtue. The sensation was so overwhelming that she forgot to breathe, forgot where she was, forgot everything except the feeling of actual soap cleaning actual dirt from actual skin. She washed her hands, her arms, her face. The lather kept coming, endless and abundant. The water kept running, hot and powerful. She expected it to stop, to turn cold, to punish her for using too much. But it never did. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 15. The water just kept flowing. Around her, the other women were experiencing their own revelations. One nurse was crying silently under her shower soap clutched to her chest. Another was washing her hair for the third time, unable to believe it could be this clean. Even Tomiko Sato stood motionless under the spray, eyes closed, resistance temporarily washed away by hot water that never ended. Reiko looked down at the soap in her hands, still mostly full, still usable for weeks, given to her without ceremony, without rationing, without the expectation that she would make it last or share it or justify its use. Just given. Because here in enemy territory, in a prison camp in Louisiana, soap was so abundant that even prisoners received whole bars for personal use. Her knees weakened. She sank down, kneeling under the running water, and something inside her broke open. Great heaving sobs that she could not control. Because if this was how Americans treated their enemies, what did that mean about how Japan treated its own citizens? If prisoners ate better than soldiers, showered with real soap, while mothers scrubbed with sand, lived in heated buildings, while children studied by candlelight, then who was truly weak? Who was truly strong? The soap slipped from her grasp, landed on the tile with a soft thud. She picked it up with shaking hands, held it against her heart, and wept for everything she had believed that was turning out to be a lie. Michiko found her there 10 minutes later. The lieutenant said nothing, just knelt beside Reiko, under the adjacent shower, and placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was enough. The acknowledgement that this was not just shock or gratitude, but something deeper. A fundamental reordering of reality that was happening to all of them, whether they admitted it or not. I know, Michiko said quietly, her own voice thick with emotion. Now we study everything. They returned to the barracks wrapped in American towels, carrying American soap, their skin clean for the first time in years. The other women looked at them with questions written on every face. Yuriko spoke first, voice small and frightened. Was it terrible? Reiko could not answer. She went to her bunk, placed the soap bar on her footlocker, and sat staring at it. Eventually, she pulled out the small journal she had been keeping, one of the few personal items she had been allowed to bring. She wrote one sentence. If a nation can produce soap for every household, it can produce dignity. If it cannot, then it produces only sacrifice. The remaining groups rotated through the showers that morning. By 0900 hours, all 73 women had experienced the same devastating kindness. The barracks smelled like ivory soap, and the silence that filled the space was the silence of worldviews crumbling. Breakfast followed at 0930. They filed into the mess hall, still processing what the showers had meant. But if soap had cracked their beliefs, food was about to shatter them completely. The serving line presented each woman with an aluminum tray. The servers, American soldiers doing routine mess duty, piled on scrambled eggs, Bacon toast with butter and jam, fried potatoes in a small bowl of oatmeal with brown sugar. Coffee real, coffee-filled metal cups. And on each tray a small glass of orange juice. The women sat at their assigned tables, stared at the food, calculated. A nurse named Keiko whispered the math to herself. Approximately 800 calories. For breakfast, just breakfast. Tomiko Sato set down her fork with a clatter. This is propaganda for photographs. Tomorrow will be different. But Michiko shook her head slowly. Look at the American soldiers. They have the same food. They are not acting like this is special. This is their normal Tuesday breakfast. The word normal hung in the air like an accusation. Reiko picked up a slice of bacon. The fat glistened under the fluorescent lights. She had not eaten pork in 3 years, had not seen bacon since before the war. She bit into it and the salt and smoke and richness flooded her mouth. It was not delicate, not refined, just abundant and real and impossibly present on a tray given to a prisoner on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She ate everything on her tray. So did most of the others. Yuriko ran to the latrine again, her stomach still unable to handle the sudden influx of nutrition. But she came back and asked quietly if she could have more toast. Corporal Mitchell, supervising the meal, smiled and said, "Y'all can have seconds if you like, honey. As much as you want." Those 5 words contained entire philosophies, entire economic systems, entire assumptions about scarcity and abundance that Japan and America did not share. In Tokyo, ration cards determined how much you could want. Here, wanting was simply accommodated because there was enough to accommodate it. The days developed a rhythm. Wake at 0630, shower with unlimited hot water and real soap, breakfast with 800 calories, work details that felt more like education than labor, lunch at 1200, more work or increasingly organized classes, dinner at 1800 with the same impossible abundance as every other meal, evening spent reading, talking, processing, and every Friday, like clockwork, dessert included ice cream. The first Friday came on March 2nd. Reiko did not know what to expect when the servers placed small bowls on each tray. White frozen substance, 2 scoops melting slightly at the edges. The translator explained, ice cream, vanilla flavor, standard Friday dessert. Standard, Friday dessert. Each word was its own earthquake. Reiko lifted her spoon. The ice cream was cold and sweet and creamy. She had read about ice cream in novels, had seen pictures in magazines from before the war, but she had never imagined she would taste it, especially not here, especially not as a prisoner. Around the mess hall, Japanese women encountered ice cream for the first time. Some cried into their bowls. Others ate in silence, faces carefully neutral. Yuriko took 1 bite and then set down her spoon, unable to continue. Not because it was bad, because her younger brother was training somewhere in the Pacific on empty rations, and the unfairness of that truth was too much to swallow. Tomiko Sato ate her entire portion with mechanical efficiency. Then she stood, walked to the waste area, and vomited into a trash can. When she returned to the table, her face was wet with tears she had not bothered to hide. How, she asked no one in particular. How do they have ice cream every Friday when we cannot keep milk from spoiling for 2 days? Corporal Mitchell, supervising the meal, overheard the question through the translator. She approached the table with genuine confusion on her friendly Iowa face. Y'all didn't have ice cream back home, not even before the war. The translator rendered this into Japanese. Michiko answered carefully. Dairy became very rare early in the war. Ice cream would have been impossible to produce or store. Sarah Mitchell's confusion deepened. But what about refrigeration? Don't y'all have electric coolers? Electricity is rationed, Michiko explained, 2 hours per evening in most areas. Refrigeration requires constant power. The American corporal's face shifted from confusion to something like pity, which was worse than contempt would have been. Pity meant she understood how far behind Japan truly was. Oh, honey, she said softly. Oh, I am so sorry. I did not realize it was that bad. She patted Michiko's shoulder awkwardly and walked away. The Japanese women sat in the wake of that pity, understanding that they had just been seen not as dangerous enemies, but as tragic victims of their own government's failures. That night's observation session was subdued, but Fumiko had something to share that would change the trajectory of their understanding. She had been on a work detail that day, part of a crew cleaning and equipment storage building. The truck that transported them had driven past a power station. I asked the driver to stop, Fumiko explained. Told him I was interested in engineering. He agreed. We stood outside the fence for 10 minutes while I looked. She pulled out a piece of paper covered in sketches and calculations. The facility was massive, 3 stories. I could hear the turbines from outside. I estimated the capacity based on the size of the cooling towers and the gauge of the power lines. Then I asked the driver how many stations like this existed in the area. The group leaned forward. He said in Rapides Parish, about 27, I reckon. This one is medium-sized. Silence. I did the math. Fumiko continued, her voice shaking. 27 medium-sized power stations in one American county. The total electrical generation capacity exceeds Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and Osaka combined. The numbers sat there like grenades. Yuriko spoke first, voice small and broken. Then we have already lost. Yes, Fumiko said simply. Not because our soldiers are not brave, not because our spirit is weak, but because one American county generates more electricity than Japan's 3 largest industrial cities. How do we fight that? How does courage defeat kilowatts? Tomiko Sato stood abruptly, walked to the center of the barracks, turned to face all 73 women. Her voice when she spoke was loud enough to reach every bunk. I have spent 3 weeks denying what we are seeing, telling myself it is propaganda, telling myself tomorrow will reveal the truth. But there is no tomorrow that changes this. The soap is real, the food is real, the electricity is real, and if all of that is real, then everything we were taught about American weakness is a lie. She paused, gathering herself. My brother is training to die, believing that Japanese spirit will overcome American materials. He will die for a lie, and I cannot save him. But maybe I can keep other brothers from dying for the same lie. She looked at Michiko. You said we should learn. I am ready to learn. What do we do? Michiko stood slowly. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when resistance transformed into something more useful. We form a committee, she said, a reconstruction committee. We study everything about how America creates this abundance. And when we go home, when Japan is defeated and broken, we teach them how to rebuild using what we learned here. Tomiko nodded. I will join. As will I, said Fumiko. And I, said Akiko. Around the barracks, voices joined in agreement. Not all 73. Some still clung to the old beliefs, unable or unwilling to accept the truth. But 47 women that night made a choice. They would stop being prisoners and start being students. They would document the systems that created abundance. And they would carry that knowledge home to a nation that desperately needed it, whether that nation wanted to hear it or not. The Reconstruction Committee met for the first time on March 15, 1940 in the corner of Barracks C that had become their unofficial headquarters. 47 women arranged themselves in a rough circle, notebooks open, pencils ready. Lieutenant Michiko Hayashi stood at the center, her bearing still military, despite weeks in captivity. We are no longer just prisoners, she began. We are scholars studying a system that defeated us. Our classroom is this camp. Our textbooks are everything we observe. And our final exam will be rebuilding Japan from ashes. She divided the women into study groups. Akiko Watanabe would lead public health, documenting sanitation, nutrition, and medical protocols. Fumiko Oshiro would focus on infrastructure, particularly electrical and water systems. Reiko Tanaka would study administrative efficiency and civic organization. Tomiko Sato, the former true believer, volunteered to examine agricultural methods and food production. We document everything, Michiko instructed. Not just what exists, but how it works, why it works, how much it costs in resources and labor. When we return home, we must be able to explain not just that America has abundance, but how they create it systematically. The American military noticed the change. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Williams, commander of the Women's Detention Section at Camp Livingston, filed a report in late March that captured the transformation. The Japanese women prisoners are no longer prisoners in the traditional sense. They observe everything with scientific precision. They study relentlessly. They plan for a future we have not yet told them they can have. We expected resistance. We expected defiance. Instead, we have found curiosity. Intense, organized, relentless curiosity. I recommend we formalize educational programs to channel this energy productively. Washington approved Williams' recommendation. By April, Camp Livingston offered structured classes 4 times per week: English language instruction, health and sanitation principles, democratic governance theory, basic engineering concepts. The Japanese women attended with the intensity of graduate students filling notebooks, asking questions, challenging their own assumptions. Reiko absorbed English with desperate hunger. Not just words, but concepts. The language itself revealed American assumptions about abundance. In Japanese, there were 17 different words for rice, depending on preparation and context, reflecting its precious scarcity. In English, there were 17 different words for abundance: plenty, ample, sufficient, copious, profuse, bountiful, excessive. Each shade of meaning assumed a world where having more than enough was the baseline. She wrote in her journal, now partially in English for practice: language reveals philosophy. Japanese language prepares us for scarcity. English language assumes abundance as normal state. To rebuild Japan, we must learn to think in abundance. Tomiko Sato's transformation was the most dramatic. The woman who had spat at American sailors in January was by April the most meticulous note-taker in the committee. She had been assigned to work in the camp's Victory Garden, a plot where soldiers grew supplemental vegetables. The American agricultural specialist, a farmer from Kansas named Eugene Carter, treated her like a colleague rather than a prisoner. He showed me crop rotation, Tomiko reported one evening, planting nitrogen-fixing beans one season to enrich soil for corn the next season. In Japan, we plant rice in the same paddies for generations until the soil is exhausted. He plants in cycles that build soil health instead of depleting it. She paused, swallowing hard. He asked why I was taking so many notes. I told him Japan would need to feed itself after the war. He said, "Well, then let me show you something even better." And he spent 3 hours teaching me about composting, irrigation efficiency, and pest management without chemicals. He taught enemy prisoner agricultural secrets because I asked. Eugene Carter's generosity haunted Tomiko. She had been raised to believe Americans were cruel and selfish. Instead, she found a Kansas farmer who spent his afternoon off teaching crop science to a woman whose country was trying to kill his countrymen. The cognitive dissonance was becoming harder to deny. In late May, letters began arriving from Japan through Red Cross channels. The first batch contained 63 letters for the 73 women. 10 received nothing, their families likely dead or displaced. The contents ranged from heartbreaking to devastating. Reiko's letter came from her mother. The handwriting was shaky, weak with malnutrition. "My dearest daughter, we pray you are alive to read this. Tokyo burned in March. Firebombing. Our neighborhood survived, but many did not. Rations are now 200 calories per day. There is no soap. I use ash and think of the tin box I kept when you were a child, when I still hoped abundance would return. It has not returned. It will not return. Your father works at the shipyard, but there is no steel to build ships. He comes home each night thinner and more silent. He will not speak of defeat, but I see it in his eyes. I hope wherever you are safe. I hope you have food. I hope you survive to see what comes after this terrible war. Your loving mother, Ayame." Reiko read the letter 3 times. Then she walked to her footlocker, retrieved the soap bar she had saved from her first shower, and held it against the paper. The soap weighed 4 ounces. Her mother was starving on 200 calories per day. And Reiko was eating 800 calories daily, showering with hot water, sleeping in a heated building, reading English poetry under electric lights that never failed. The guilt was crushing, but beneath the guilt was something else. Anger. Not at Americans for treating her well, but at her own government for lying so thoroughly that even in defeat they could not admit the truth. Her father worked in a shipyard with no steel. Her mother scrubbed with ash while American prisoners had soap. And still the official line was that Japanese spirit would prevail. Yuriko's letter arrived the same day. Her mother's words were brief and brutal. "Your younger brother Kenji was killed in Okinawa on April 9th. He was 17. We had no food for proper funeral. Please forgive us. Please come home. Father." Yuriko did not cry when she read it. She simply folded the letter, placed it in her footlocker, and sat on her bunk, staring at nothing. That evening, she did not attend the observation session. She did not eat dinner. She just sat processing the fact that her brother had died, fighting for an empire that could not even feed its soldiers, while she ate ice cream every Friday as a prisoner of that empire's enemies. The next morning, she joined the Reconstruction Committee. For Kenji, she said quietly to Machiko, he died for lies. I will live for truth. Then came August 6, 1945. Word spread through Camp Livingston that something unprecedented had happened. An American bomb had destroyed Hiroshima, not with conventional explosives, but with some new weapon of unimaginable power. The details were scarce, but the implications were clear. If America had developed a weapon that could erase entire cities, the war was effectively over. August 9th, another bomb, Nagasaki. Fumiko Oshiro collapsed when she heard. Nagasaki was her home city. Her parents, her siblings, possibly gone in an instant. She spent 2 days in the infirmary, sedated while her mind tried to process grief too large to contain. August 15th, the announcement every woman had been dreading and expecting. Emperor Hirohito would address the nation by radio. Lieutenant Colonel Williams arranged for the Japanese prisoners to listen to the broadcast in the camp's recreation hall. 73 women gathered in silence. The radio crackled to life. The emperor's voice, high and reedy, and speaking in formal court Japanese that sounded alien and archaic, announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. Unconditional surrender. The room erupted in noise. Some women sobbed openly. Others sat frozen in shock. A few muttered prayers to ancestors. Yuriko Kimura screamed once, a raw sound of anguish for her brother, who had died for nothing, and then fell silent. Reiko felt grief and relief in equal measure. Grief for a homeland destroyed, for families dead or broken, for dreams that would never be realized. Relief that the calculations had been correct. Japan had lost to production lines, not to failed spirit. Relief that maybe finally the dying would stop. But beneath grief and relief was something else, a terrible clarity. Japan had lost because it had bet everything on spirit while America had built systems. And now Japan would have to learn what these 73 women had spent 6 months learning. That abundance, not scarcity, was the foundation of national strength. Michiko Hayashi stood slowly. She walked to the front of the recreation hall, pulled from her pocket the soap bar she carried everywhere now, held it above her head like a banner. Listen to me, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. We have just heard our emperor admit defeat. Some of you are thinking about honor, about shame, about how we face this humiliation. But I tell you, there is no humiliation in losing to an enemy that fed us better than our own government did. No shame in being defeated by a nation that gave us soap while our mothers scrubbed with ash. She paused, letting the words sink in. This soap represents both our defeat and our future. We were conquered by assembly lines, by farms that produce surplus, by power grids that never fail, by systems so robust they could afford to waste resources on our comfort even while fighting us. That is not weakness. That is strength so overwhelming it can afford to be gentle. She looked around the room, meeting eyes demanding attention. The war is over, but our mission is just beginning. We have learned how America creates abundance. Now we must take that knowledge home and rebuild Japan into a nation that can feed its children, heat its homes, and produce enough soap that no mother ever has to hoard slivers in a tin box. Tomiko Sato stood. I will help rebuild. Fumiko Oshiro, tears streaming, but voice steady, stood as well. For Nagasaki, I will help rebuild. One by one, women rose. Not all 73. Some were too broken by grief. Some too angry. But 58 women stood that day and committed to becoming teachers of abundance when they returned to a homeland that had only known sacrifice. In October, a local rancher visited Camp Livingston. His name was Buck Morrison, 68 years old, weathered by sun and work, third-generation Texas cattleman who had somehow ended up in Louisiana teaching prisoners about American values. Lieutenant Colonel Williams had invited him as part of what she called cultural education. Buck arrived on horseback, a chestnut mare named Dusty, wearing a Stetson hat so worn it had molded to the shape of his head. He tied Dusty to a fence post and addressed the assembled women through a translator. Colonel Williams told me y'all are fixing to go home and rebuild your country. Said you've been studying American ways. Well, I ain't educated like them professors, but I know a thing or two about building something that lasts. So I figured I'd share some cowboy wisdom if you're interested. The women, intrigued by this living embodiment of American mythology, listened intently. Buck spent 3 hours talking about ranching, about treating animals with respect because cruelty produced inferior beef, about rotating grazing lands to prevent soil depletion, about the cowboy code that his grandfather had taught him. Never kill what you cannot eat. Never waste what you can use. Never harm what does not need harming. Take only what you need and leave the rest for tomorrow. Tomiko raised her hand, but that is conservation. I thought America was about abundance, not conservation. Buck smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Ma'am, abundance and conservation ain't it opposites. They're partners. You build abundance by not wasting what you got. My granddaddy's ranch has been producing cattle for 70 years because we take care of the land. Abundance without wisdom is just waste. And waste is the opposite of both abundance and conservation. The women absorbed this. They had assumed American abundance meant carelessness, excess without thought. But Buck was describing something more sophisticated. Systematic abundance maintained through careful stewardship. When the session ended, Yuriko approached Buck shyly. Why did you come today? Why spend your time teaching prisoners? Buck adjusted his Stetson, considering the question seriously. Colonel Williams said y'all might be going home to rebuild. Figured you could use some American common sense. Besides, war's over. You ain't enemies no more. Just folks trying to do right by your country. I respect that. He untied Dusty, swung into the saddle with the ease of long practice, tipped his hat, and rode off. The women stood watching him disappear, processing the casual generosity of a stranger who had given half his day to teach ranching wisdom to former enemies because someone asked him to. That image, an elderly cowboy on a dusty horse tipping his hat to Japanese women prisoners, became something they would carry forever. Not as a symbol of American power, but of American character. The kind of character that assumed helping others was just what decent people did. November brought Thanksgiving. The women had heard of the holiday but did not understand its significance. Mrs. Freeman, the English teacher, explained it was a day for expressing gratitude, for gathering with family, for celebrating abundance. On November 22, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Williams made an announcement that stunned the barracks. Ladies, you are invited to Thanksgiving dinner in the officers' mess hall, not as prisoners, as guests of the United States Army. Dress appropriately and arrive at 1800 hours. The women debated what this meant. Was it propaganda, a trick? But Machiko settled the question simply. It is an opportunity to observe American culture at its most revealing. We accept. At 1800 hours, 73 Japanese women filed into a hall decorated with autumn leaves, cornucopias, and small American flags. Tables were set with white tablecloths, real China cloth napkins. And the food, dear God, the food. Roasted turkeys, golden and massive, more meat on one bird than Reiko had seen in a year. Mashed potatoes in mountains drowning in gravy. Cranberry sauce, bright red and sweet. Stuffing rich with herbs. Green bean casserole. Rolls with butter, real butter piled high. And pies, pumpkin apple pecan. Whole pies, not slices, not rations, but entire pies. Colonel Williams stood. In America, Thanksgiving is about gratitude. Today, we are grateful the war is over. We are grateful for the chance to build peace instead of waging war. We are grateful you are here safe and learning, preparing to help your country rebuild. Please eat as our guests. Celebrate this day of thanks with us. The women sat, stared at plates being filled with more food than entire families in Tokyo would see in a month. Reiko tried to calculate the calories and gave up. Thousands per person, maybe 5,000, for one meal on a Thursday. Tomiko whispered, Why? Why do this for us? Michiko answered quietly, because they can afford to. Because abundance breeds generosity. Remember this, Japan will need both. Before the meal began, a chaplain stood to offer a blessing. He asked if anyone wanted to add a prayer of their own. Silence stretched. Then Yuriko Kimura, 19 years old brother, dead home destroyed, stood on shaking legs. In careful English, she spoke. I thank for food. I thank for kindness. I thank for soap. Her voice caught on the last word. In Japan, we learn sacrifice is strength. Here you show me give is strength. I am enemy. You give me turkey. I do not understand. But I will remember. Forever remember. She sat down abruptly, tears flowing. The room was absolutely silent. Then Corporal Sarah Mitchell began clapping. Then Colonel Williams. Then every American in the room. A standing ovation for a 19-year-old enemy prisoner who had just learned that generosity was a form of power more devastating than any bomb. December arrived. Repatriation was finally scheduled. American servicemen were coming home first, understandably. But by January, the first groups of prisoners would follow. 73 women would sail for Japan, all of them, including every member of the Reconstruction Committee. On January 20th, 1946, the night before departure, the 73 women gathered in Barracks C one final time. They sat in a circle, each holding a bar of ivory soap. Some had saved their original bar from February. Others had newer ones. But all held soap, the symbol of everything they had learned. Michiko spoke first. When we return, some will call us traitors. Some will say we lived too well while Japan suffered. They may be right to judge us. But we have a mission that supersedes their judgment. We will rebuild Japan not with sacrifice, but with systems. The next morning, they boarded trucks for New Orleans. From there, a ship to Yokohama. The SS Pacific Star, the same vessel that had brought some of them to America nearly a year before. But they were not the same women who had arrived. They had been transformed by soap and electricity and ice cream and turkey dinners and cowboy wisdom and democratic theory and everything else that added up to the devastating lesson of American abundance. As the ship pulled away from dock, Reiko stood at the rail looking back at Louisiana. In her bag, 5 notebooks filled with observations. In her pocket, the soap bar she had saved from her very first shower, now wrapped carefully in cloth, plus 2 more she had been given over the months. 3 bars total, 3 pieces of evidence. In her heart, terror and hope in equal measure. 6 days at sea. 73 women processing what came next. They reviewed their notes, organized their knowledge, practiced, explaining complex systems in simple Japanese, anticipating questions and objections from a population that might not want to hear that their enemies had valuable lessons to teach. Michiko led a session on reintegration challenges. We will arrive healthy while Japan starves. We will wear American coats while civilians shiver in rags. We will return having lived better as prisoners than our families lived as free citizens. Some will call us traitors. Some will say we should have died with honor rather than survive in comfort. We must be prepared to face these accusations with truth, not anger. Reiko raised her hand. How do we convince them we are not traitors? Michiko smiled grimly. We do not convince them with words. We convince them with results. We teach what we learned. We help rebuild. We show them that knowledge is not betrayal. It is the only tool we have to prevent this catastrophe from happening again. Some will never accept us, but enough will listen, and that will be enough. January 27th, 1946. Dawn broke over Tokyo Harbor. The SS Pacific Star approached slowly, carefully navigating, water still cluttered with the debris of war. 73 women stood at the rails watching their homeland emerge from morning mist. A homeland transformed by fire and defeat into something they barely recognized. The skyline was wrong. Buildings they had known their entire lives simply were not there anymore. Entire neighborhoods reduced to skeletal ruins. The great industrial port of Yokohama looked like a mouth with half its teeth knocked out. And everywhere smoke. Not the smoke of factories and prosperity, but the smoke of braziers where people burned anything they could find to stay warm. The ship docked at 09:17 hours. A crowd waited behind barriers. Families searching for faces. Officials with clipboards. Photographers from occupation newspapers. And everywhere the hollow-eyed stare of a population that had lost everything and did not yet know how to find hope again. The women descended the gangway in single file. Reiko's eyes scanned the crowd searching. There, her mother Ayame Tanaka, 48 years old but looking 70. Skeletal thin, dressed in patched clothing that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Her face, when she saw Reiko, crumpled into tears. Behind Ayame stood Hiroshi Tanaka, 62 years old. Gaunt, silent. His engineer's hands, once so steady and sure, trembled slightly as they hung at his sides. His eyes moved from Reiko's face to her American-issued wool coat, to her clean hair, to her leather shoes, to the healthy color in her cheeks. Then he turned and walked away without a word. Ayame rushed forward as soon as the barriers lifted. She touched Reiko's coat with trembling fingers, felt the quality of the fabric, the warmth of the wool. "This," she whispered, her voice breaking, "this is finer than anything we have seen in 4 years." Reiko embraced her mother, felt the bones too close to the surface, smelled the ash and deprivation that no amount of scrubbing could quite remove. "Mother, I am home." "Are you?" Ayame pulled back, searched her daughter's face. "Or are you someone else now?" Before Reiko could answer, a neighbor woman approached. Mrs. Fujiwara, who had lived 3 houses down for as long as Reiko could remember. Her face was hard, judgmental. "My son died at Iwo Jima," she said flatly. "He died weighing 90 pounds because there was no food. You look well fed." The accusation hung in the air. Around them, other reunions were happening with similar tensions. Tomiko Sato stood alone at the barrier, her family visible, but not approaching. Her younger sister finally came forward, whispered urgently, "Mother says you are welcome home, but neighbors are watching. Please understand." Yuriko's mother clutched her daughter and sobbed, but the aunts stood back, faces closed. One muttered just loud enough to hear, "While Kenji starved, she grew fat on enemy food." The women were processed through occupation checkpoints, given temporary housing assignments, told to report for interviews the following week. Then they dispersed into a city that did not quite know what to do with them. Reiko's first night home was spent in the house where she had grown up, now cold and dim and smelling of poverty. The electricity came on at 1800 hours as scheduled and failed at 2000 hours as scheduled. In the darkness, she heard her parents in the next room. Hiroshi's voice thick with something between anger and despair. "She looks like she had a vacation while we starved." Ayame quiet but firm. "She looks alive. Be grateful." Grateful, she returns, well-fed and healthy, and grateful to our enemies. What did they do to her mind? Perhaps they told her the truth you refused to admit. Silence, then the sound of Hiroshi leaving the house, the door sliding shut with finality. Reiko lay on her futon, staring at ceiling beams she had memorized as a child, and understood that the hardest battle was just beginning. She had survived capture. She had adapted to abundance. She had prepared to teach. But she had not fully prepared for this, for the wall of suspicion and shame that her own people would build between themselves and the truth she carried. The next weeks were brutal. Everywhere the women went, they faced questions that were really accusations. "How did you stay so healthy? What did you do to earn such treatment? Why do you look better than us?" Some of the women broke under the pressure. 3 recanted everything, claimed they had been tortured and forced to accept American propaganda. They were welcomed back into the fold, their lies more comfortable than the truth. But 55 women held firm. They began teaching quietly at first. Tomiko found work at a girls' school, rewrote curriculum to include basic sanitation and nutrition. Akiko volunteered at hospitals, demonstrating hand-washing protocols that seemed absurdly simple, but cut infection rates in half. Fumiko sought out engineers working on reconstruction, shared her observations about power grid design and electrical distribution. Most laughed at her at first. A woman trying to teach men about engineering, ridiculous. But when her suggestions proved sound, when her calculations matched what American advisors were recommending, some began to listen. And Reiko applied to every teaching position she could find. School after school rejected her. The POW stigma was too strong. No one wanted a woman who had lived comfortably with the enemy teaching their children. But in October 1947, nearly 2 years after her return, a letter arrived. Daido Chemical Company, a mid-sized soap manufacturer struggling to rebuild after wartime destruction, was looking for an administrative assistant. Reiko's English skills and organizational experience made her a candidate. The interview took place in a drafty office that smelled of lie and desperation. The company president, Mr. Kawasaki, was 55, pragmatic and running out of options. His factory could barely produce enough soap for military contracts. The civilian market was a dream he could not reach. "Why should I hire a former POW?" he asked bluntly. Reiko placed her Camp Livingston soap bar on his desk, still mostly intact after nearly 2 years. Still fragrant, still perfect. Because I have held American soap and Japanese ash. I know the difference is not magic. It is systems. I know how they produce abundance. I can teach you those systems. And I can help Daido become the company that gives every Japanese household what I had in Louisiana. The dignity of being clean. Kawasaki picked up the soap, smelled it, looked at Reiko with new eyes. When can you start? Tomorrow. Production efficiency consultant, you will redesign our manufacturing process using American methods. Can you do that? Reiko smiled for the first time in months. Yes, sir. I learned from the best teachers. My enemies. February 1948. Reiko returned home after her first week at Daito Chemical, exhausted but energized. She found her father in his workshop surrounded by blueprints from the shipyard. He looked up when she entered, then back down at his work. Father, I need to talk to you. Silence. I have a job. At Daito Chemical, they are letting me redesign their production systems. More silence. Father, please, we have not spoken in 2 years. I cannot bear this anymore. Hiroshi set down his pencil, looked at his daughter with eyes that held 2 years of confusion and shame and anger, and something else. Something that might have been fear. What did they do to you? He asked finally. In that camp, what did they do that made you forget who you are? Reiko pulled out her notebooks, 5 of them, hundreds of pages of observations, sketches, calculations. She placed them on his workbench. Then she pulled out her soap bar, the one she had carried for 2 years, and set it beside the notebooks. They did not do anything to me, Father. They showed me. They showed me that everything you taught me about American weakness was wrong. They showed me that abundance is not decadence. It is the foundation of national strength. She opened the first notebook. This is how they distribute electricity. Every building all the time, unlimited. This is how they organize supply chains. This is how they train workers. This is how they build systems that produce surplus instead of scarcity. Hiroshi stared at the pages. His hands moved toward them, then pulled back. This is not propaganda. Reiko continued, her voice steady despite tears forming. This is reality. And if you love Japan, if you truly want our country to be strong again, you will help me teach this truth. So no more mothers hoard soap in tin boxes and call it virtue. So no more children study by candlelight and call it character. So no more soldiers die with empty rifles and empty stomachs and call it honor. She picked up the soap bar, held it out to her father. This is not propaganda. This is truth. And truth is heavier than soap. And truth, like soap, washes everything clean. Hiroshi looked at the soap in his daughter's hand. At the notebooks filled with knowledge he had spent his whole life denying. At the reality he could no longer avoid. His hands shook as he reached out, took the soap, held it to his nose, and inhaled the scent of American abundance. And something inside him, something that had been holding rigid for 40 years, finally broke. He stood, left the workshop without a word. Reiko waited, unsure if she had pushed too far, if she had lost him completely. 10 minutes later, he returned. In his hands, a worn leather journal. He placed it on the workbench beside her notebooks. My engineering diary, he said quietly. From 1930 to 1945, I studied American industrial methods my entire career, admired them secretly, praised them privately, but publicly I condemned them, because that was what the empire required. He opened the journal to a page from 1935, sketches of assembly line configurations, notes about Ford's production techniques, calculations about American manufacturing efficiency. I knew, he whispered. I always knew we would lose. I knew our spirit could not defeat their systems, but I could not say it, could not admit it, could not teach it. And I sent young men to die for lies I knew were lies, because I was too cowardly to tell the truth. He looked at Reiko, and for the first time in her life, she saw her father cry. You are braver than I ever was. You will teach what I could not. You will build what I destroyed. He placed his journal in her hands. For your children. So they know even the wrong can learn right. Eventually, father and daughter stood in the workshop, 2 years of silence, finally broken, holding truth between them in notebooks and soap and tears. The years that followed were not easy, but they were transformative. Reiko worked at Daito Chemical with the intensity of someone who understood that every bar of soap was a small victory over the lies that had destroyed her country. By 1950, Daito had tripled production using Reiko's American-inspired assembly methods. By 1952, they were producing affordable soap for middle-class households. By 1955, they were the largest soap manufacturer in Western Japan. Reiko's career followed the same trajectory. 1947 consultant, 1949 production manager, 1952 operations director, 1955 vice president. But she was not alone in this transformation. Across Japan, the women of the soap awakening were quietly changing the nation. Michiko Hayashi joined the Ministry of Health in 1951, standardized sanitation protocols nationwide, soap education in schools, water treatment requirements, public health campaigns that emphasized prevention over treatment. By 1955, infant mortality had dropped 40%. Fumiko Oshiro became a consultant to MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. She advised on industrial policy, power grid expansion, factory efficiency. Her fingerprints were on the infrastructure that would power Japan's manufacturing boom. Akiko Watanabe became dean of a nursing school in 1953, trained over 1,000 nurses in hygiene practices learned at Camp Livingston. Hospitals transformed. Sterilization became standard. Infection rates plummeted. Tomiko Sato, the former True Believer, became an education ministry curriculum advisor in 1954. She rewrote textbooks, removed propaganda, added practical science, sanitation, nutrition. Her work influenced over 2 million students. And Yuriko Kimura, the youngest, became director of Tokyo Metropolitan Hospital in 1958. At 33, the youngest hospital director in Japan, she implemented systematic protocols that became national standards. They did not get credit publicly. They were women, former POWs, people society wanted to forget. But they knew. In quiet moments over tea, they would share stories. I implemented Louisiana water systems in Osaka. I taught Tokyo nurses the importance of washing hands with soap between patients. I showed my factory how Americans organize supply chains. They had become the invisible architects of Japan's economic miracle. May 15, 1955. Yokohama. The day that would change everything. Daito Chemical's new flagship factory stood gleaming in the morning sun. Modern, efficient, designed using every principle Reiko had learned in Louisiana and refined over 8 years of patient implementation. The facility would produce 10,000 bars of soap daily, more than the entire Japanese soap industry had produced weekly before the war. 200 people attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony, government officials, business leaders, photographers. Reiko Tanaka, 36 years old, vice president of operations, prepared to cut the ribbon. And in the very back, almost hidden behind a support column, stood Hiroshi Tanaka, 68 years old, frail, using a cane. But there, ribbon cut, applause, factory tour begins. Reiko leads the group through the facility, explaining assembly processes, quality control systems, distribution, logistics. Everything she learned that February morning in 1945 when she held soap for the first time and understood that abundance was power. The tour ends at the production line, automated mixing, mechanized molding, conveyor systems moving bars of soap in endless procession. One every 8.6 seconds, 7,000 per shift, pure white, perfectly formed, affordable. Hiroshi follows at a distance, saying nothing to anyone, but his eyes take in everything. The machinery, the organization, the systematic creation of abundance where scarcity had once ruled. He stops at the main conveyor belt, watches bars of soap rolling past, reaches out with his trembling hand, picks one up, holds it to the light exactly as Reiko had done in that Louisiana shower 10 years ago, and tears begin streaming down his face. Reiko sees him from across the factory floor. She excuses herself from the officials, walks slowly toward her father. They stand side by side watching soap bars roll past. Neither speaks for 3 minutes. Finally, Hiroshi whispers, "I told you abundance makes people weak." Reiko, voice soft but steady, "You were wrong, father." "I know." Long silence. The machinery hums. Soap bars continue their endless journey toward Japanese households that will finally, after years of scarcity, be able to afford to be clean. "But you were right that Japan must be strong," Reiko continues. "We just learned that strength comes from feeding people, not starving them. From building systems, not destroying them. from producing soap, not hoarding ash. Hiroshi holds up the soap bar with both hands as if it weighs more than 4 ounces, as if it weighs the burden of 40 years of lies he believed and taught and enforced. I spent 40 years building warships that sank. You spent 10 years learning to build this. Yours will last longer. Yours will matter more. He places the soap in Reiko's hands, bows to his daughter, not the quick bow of social custom, the deep bow of respect, of acknowledgement, of something very close to apology. Then he straightens, turns, and walks toward the exit. But before he leaves, he stops, looks back at his daughter, standing in the factory she built from knowledge gained in enemy captivity. Teach them, he says, teach them what I could not. Build what I destroyed. Be what I was too afraid to be. He leaves. Reiko stands holding the soap bar he gave her, understanding that this is the closest to reconciliation they will ever achieve, and understanding that it is enough. 2 months later, a package arrives at Reiko's home. Inside, her father's complete engineering notebooks. Every page from 1920 to 1945. 40 years of secret admiration for American methods, private calculations about Japanese inadequacy, documented knowledge he never dared share, and a note in his precise engineer's handwriting. For your children, so they know even the wrong can learn right. Eventually, build the Japan. I could only dream of your proud father, Hiroshi. He died 3 weeks later, quietly in his sleep, having finally unburdened himself of the lies he carried for a lifetime. The years flowed forward. Japan rebuilt not just physically but philosophically. The generation raised on sacrifice is strength was slowly replaced by young people learning that systems create abundance. In 1967, Tomiko Sato published a book, From Defeat to Development, How POW Camps Taught Japan to Rebuild. It became a bestseller, controversial but undeniable. The introduction opened with words that would define a generation. Japan's future was born not in Tokyo's ashes but in Louisiana's soap and ice cream. We were defeated by abundance. We rebuilt with abundance. This is not shame. This is wisdom. The 1970s brought recognition. NHK produced a documentary on Reconstruction. Interviews with the women who had survived Camp Livingston, now in their 50s and 60s, many retired, some still working. Reiko Tanaka, 54, retired. Vice president of Daito Chemical, sat for her interview in the factories she had built. Behind her, the production line still hummed, now producing 50,000 bars daily. She held one of the bars, turned it over in her hands the way she had held that first bar in 1945. My life changed in a shower in Louisiana, she said to the camera. That bar of soap taught me that true power is not fear or sacrifice. True power is when every household can afford to be clean. When abundance is so common, it becomes unremarkable. When generosity is possible because there is enough to be generous with. She smiled, and in that smile was the young woman who had tested a light switch 17 times, who had wept under endless hot water, who had learned that enemies could teach better lessons than friends. For 73 Japanese women, POWs of 1945, defeat came not with bullets, but with a bar of soap. We returned to a broken homeland with a simple truth. Strength is not scarcity dressed as spirit, but the ability to make daily necessities unremarkable. The documentary ended with statistics. By 1970, Japanese life expectancy had risen to 75 years. Infant mortality had dropped to 13 per 1,000. Soap production had reached 450,000 tons annually. Household electricity coverage had reached 99.8%. GDP per capita had climbed to $2,000. The economic miracle, built on rubble and notebooks from Louisiana. January 27, 1976. 30 years since return. Imperial Hotel, Tokyo. 58 surviving women of the original 73 gathered for a reunion. The table centerpiece held 73 bars of Daito soap, one for each original prisoner, including 15 deceased. They were older now, gray-haired, some using canes, but their eyes still held the sharp observation of women who had learned to see truth through propaganda, abundance through scarcity, strength through gentleness. Tomiko, 54, raised her glass. We were defeated by abundance. We rebuilt with abundance. The circle closes. Yuriko, 49, hospital director, smiled through tears. My brother died so I could learn. I learned so Japan could live. I think he would approve. Michiko, 65, retired from the Ministry of Health, nodded slowly. America gave us soap. We gave Japan systems. That seems a fair trade. Reiko brought her daughter Keiko, born 1950, and granddaughter Hannah, born 1971. 5-year-old Hannah played with a soap bar from the centerpiece, completely unaware of its weight, its history, its meaning. Reiko watched her granddaughter and felt something like peace. She will never know scarcity, she said quietly to the women around her. She will never wash with ash. She will never study by candlelight. She will never be told that sacrifice is strength. That is our victory. Not over America, but over the lies we told ourselves about what makes a nation great. The reunion ended with a moment of silence for the 15 who had died, for the families lost in the war, for a Japan that had been destroyed so completely it had no choice but to be rebuilt correctly. Then they went their separate ways, these women who had been prisoners and students and teachers and architects. They had transformed defeat into education, enemies into instructors, and soap into a symbol of everything their country had needed to learn. 3 months later, Reiko visited her father's grave, placed a bar of Daito soap on the headstone, a ritual she performed quarterly. "You were wrong about abundance, father," she whispered. "But you were right to want Japan to be strong. We just learned that strength comes from systems, not sacrifice. From feeding children, not starving them. From producing soap, not hoarding ash. From telling truth, not maintaining lies." Behind her, modern Tokyo hummed with prosperity. Neon lights, skyscrapers, abundance everywhere. The city her father had known had been destroyed. The city that replaced it was built on lessons learned in Louisiana by women who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not forged of steel, but carved into a small, white bar that lathers in the palm of your hand. Reiko stood ready to leave, but she paused, looked back at the grave one final time. "Thank you," she said, "for finally believing me, for giving me your notebooks, for admitting you were wrong. That took more courage than maintaining the lies would have." She walked away through a cemetery that held the ashes of old Japan, walked toward a city that represented new Japan, a Japan that fed its people, heated its homes, produced enough soap that no mother ever had to hoard slivers in a tin box. And as she walked, she thought about those 73 women, about Michiko's pragmatic leadership, about Tomiko's dramatic conversion, about Yuriko's courage, about Fumiko's technical brilliance, about Akiko's medical precision, about all of them learning and teaching and building and transforming. They had been captured as enemies, treated as students, returned as teachers, and become the quiet architects of a miracle. This is how America won the peace, not with occupation, but with soap, not with force, but with the devastating kindness of abundance, not through humiliation, but through education. And Japan, rebuilt by 73 women who learned this lesson, would never forget. The soap awakening had come full circle, from a shower in Louisiana to factories in Tokyo, from enemy prisoners to national architects, from scarcity to abundance, from lies to truth. 4 ounces of soap. That is all it took to change a nation. That and 73 women brave enough to learn from their enemies and teach their people. That and the understanding that true strength is not how much you can endure, but how much you can build. That and the wisdom to know that abundance, not sacrifice, is the foundation of everything worth creating. The story ends where it began, with a bar of soap, with a woman standing beneath running water, with the devastating lesson that kindness can defeat cruelty, that generosity can overcome hatred, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply showing people a better way to live. This is the untold story of the soap awakening. And it is true.